So Darwin eventually sat down and penned a book, and he spent a long time. You're talking pretty much decades. This was about 1858 that he officially wrote this, and the Beagle arrived back in like the mid 1820s. So he had decades where he was processing his information. He was ultimately formulating this theory of natural selection and how it would work to cause evolution, and he was backing it up with as much evidence as he could. So he eventually had a book worth of ideas and evidence. Now, he might have sat on it even longer because he was worried about potential backlash, because obviously back then you had much more of a religious overtone. So even in the scientific community, there was some kickback if you suggested things that seemed to defy what most people understood as being a biblical universe, if we will. But eventually a guy named Alfred Wallace came up to him with his own idea that was basically natural selection, just like Darwin had thought. Now, because Wallace only had a two-page paper and he didn't have a whole lot of evidence to it, it was more just an idea, Darwin just kind of pushed himself forward with his full-fledged book. And they did co-present this when they were presenting it to other scientists at the time, and so this idea really should be credited to both of them. But because Darwin had a book that fully fleshed it out and had so much evidence behind it, most people tend to give Darwin the credit, whereas Wallace, who did get the idea later than Darwin, we don't really give him near as much of the credit. But I still want to mention him. Some of the things to know about natural selection. First of all, natural selection is not evolution. Natural selection explains how evolution occurs. So it's kind of like if you were to have a particular electronic device. Natural selection is a lot like the batteries in that electrical device. It's not the device itself, but it's what allows the device to work. So evolution would be like your phone. The other thing to note about natural selection is it's not random. When we talk about natural selection, there's going to be two key ideas. One you've probably heard of, and that's the kind of survival of the fittest idea, that some individuals that possess certain traits, by nature of having those traits, are more or less likely to survive. So in simple terms, if you have rabbits, if they're neon pink, they would be less likely to survive, and if they're camouflaged, if they're brown, and they're in an area that's mostly brown, then ultimately they'll be more likely to survive. That's the first part. But the second part, and perhaps the most important part, is not just survival, they also have to have better reproduction, because certain individuals will reproduce more and they will produce healthier offspring than other individuals. And this is the critical part, because by passing on your genes more than others, certain genes become more popular in the gene pool. So if I have a lot of kids and other people don't, you might see the incidence of like red hair or being amazing become more popular. And so over generations, we can get where a species starts to shift in its characteristics, where some traits become more and more popular. And so this allows us to get this change over time. You do need to survive typically to be able to reproduce. That's kind of critical. But you could also survive but be sterile. You could also survive but be repulsive to the opposite gender. And so it's not a guarantee that just because you survive that you've been successful at this idea of natural selection. To do that, it's more about the reproduction idea. So why would natural selection actually occur in nature? Why would some individuals survive and reproduce better than others? Well, observations made by Darwin, as well as other people like Malthus who did population studies, we knew certain observations to be true. So we know in nature that organisms tend to produce lots of offspring, far more than they should just to keep the population size steady. But we also know that despite all these babies, the population size stays about the same. And so there must be this idea that some of these babies are seemingly not becoming adults. We also know that organisms within any population or species vary. If I were to go around and look at a classroom, look at a family, look at pretty much anything, you're going to notice that there might be different heights, different body builds, different eye color, hair color, different speeds, different musculature. There's plenty of differences that we see when we look at any group of organisms, even if they're the same species. And we notice that these organisms, especially through artificial selection, the breeding that we were doing, we know that there are these traits that seem to be passed on. Now, at the time that Darwin was working, that was before Mendel, so we didn't know how. But we still knew that bigger organisms tended to have offspring that were bigger, because we used this when we did artificial selection to make those big dogs, little dogs, bigger cows, cows that produce more milk. So we knew that there was some ability to pass on your traits. And we also know that environments don't have unlimited amounts of food. I mean, if you go back to the 1800s, there were still famines. So we were very acutely aware of the fact that sometimes we ran out of food or ran out of water. And so this was another observation that was kind of kicking around in Darwin's mind as he tried to figure out how natural selection would work and why it makes sense. Now this ties in with these inferences. So these are things that Darwin said, well, this must be the case if these observations are true. And he kind of packaged these together to officially get natural selection. So he said, if we have all these babies, but they're not making it to adulthood in many cases, there must be some struggle for survival, because only some of them are going to make it to adulthood. This is a race that only a few are going to win and a bunch are going to lose. So he inferred that there's a struggle to survive. It's not a guarantee. He also inferred, because there's variation, that some individuals with some of those heritable variations do a better job of surviving and do a better job of reproducing and passing on those traits, like we talked about those camouflaged rabbits versus the neon pink ones. And then lastly, he realized that this whole idea seems to occur over many generations, that it's not like this struggle for survival and this differential survival and reproduction happens like immediately. He knew from the observations in nature as well as artificial selection, it took many generations for this to build up, but he also knew we had many generations for this to occur. So we could have this concept he called descent with modification, where you just keep having dogs produce dogs. That's kind of normal, it's descent. But along the way, if certain dogs are favored, they can be modified. So dogs can still keep passing on and keep going throughout time, but they can also get smaller or bigger at the same time. They can be modified over the generations based on who survived and based upon who reproduced. And so all three of these all packaged together is what gives us this idea, this concept of natural selection, that there is a struggle for survival. And some individuals are kind of born with a good genetic hand where they have traits that make them better able to survive and better able to reproduce. And so over multiple generations, their traits can be passed on and amplified, which allows us to get large changes to species in terms of morphology, shape, structure, given enough time. Now, this doesn't require any outside sculpting because nature itself is doing the sculpting. Because if you have individuals born with a variety of different fur colors, some of those fur colors will just kind of accidentally, you could say, be camouflaged. That part is accidental. There is a randomness to mutation. There's a randomness to what alleles are present. But natural selection is not random because based on the environment you're in, certain traits will consistently be good because, that random color happens to be consistently advantageous because you're camouflaged. And so those individuals with that trait consistently will then survive and reproduce better than all the other colors. And so that color, which at one point would likely have been new, it would have been a new mutation, will now become essentially the default color for that species. So to give you an idea of natural selection, in action, because this was a thing that occurred in the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution, but also just to give you a nice pictorial idea of how this works over time. Before the Industrial Revolution, tree trunks were fairly light, and so when you look at the peppered moth, you'd see that there was a light version, and that version was by far the most common. 90-some% of moths were light colored. And this appears to be in large part, not completely necessarily, but in large part, because they were naturally, kind of accidentally for them, camouflaged. And so when birds were trying to feed, the birds would feed more upon the individuals that were darker because they stuck out more. And so the darker ones did not survive or reproduce as much, so they were a relatively small portion of the population. Now, after all of this pollution, you can see the smokestacks here from the Industrial Revolution, you had ash and soot start to build up on the trees, and it darkened the bark of the trees. So now the individuals that had the darker form essentially were able to blend in better, and the individuals that were the lighter morph or form, they ultimately stuck out more. And so you saw essentially over a span of a couple decades a complete flip in terms of the default color. You now saw that the vast majority of moths were a darker color, and the individuals that were lighter were the ones that stuck out. They were the ones that were being disproportionately eaten, and so they were not able to pass on their genes. And you can see this in real life, where there's a picture here where this particular tree is a lighter colored tree. We've done a good job of trying to avoid having all the pollution now. But you can see on this tree how this one blends in much, much better than this one does. So on this particular tree, the light colored moth would be the one that would be favored at this moment, because that one's better camouflaged than the dark one. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that it's not like there's somebody choosing which moth lives or dies. It's just based upon their luck as to what allele they had, what allele they express, that determines whether they happen to blend in while they're just sitting around trying to do their thing, or whether they happen to stand out. And you can see the same idea over here, where based on the particular, in this case we'll do a resistance to like a disease, certain individuals that have a higher level of resistance survive and reproduce better. So over time you'll see the population starts to be composed of all individuals that tend to have mid to high level resistances, because those individuals that did not make it. They did not survive, they did not reproduce, and so ultimately they took their, at least for the moment, bad alleles down with them. And so those alleles either become less common, or in some cases those alleles are completely wiped out of the gene pool. Now in the next section we're going to get far more into the evidence behind evolution via natural selection. But just to make it clear, there's a lot of evidence behind evolution via natural selection. For about 150 years now, we've been collecting evidence, and time after time after time, including evidences that did not exist prior to things like genetics, where we didn't know about this when Darwin was doing his work, and so this could have completely disproven everything. Yet we find that it completely agrees with the idea of evolution via natural selection.